Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from an article that was posted 2 days ago. Showed up on my Google feed, and I thought it was really interesting. And I'm not going to read, there's a whole lot of science involved in it. So I'm just going to read mainly the first part of the article and then move on to the second or the last part of the article as well. The title of it is Has a Super Intellect Monkeyed with Our Universe's Physics? I want you to know, and of course, a lot of this is involving individuals. This is actually being written by a fellow by the name of Steve Meyer, and he wrote a book, and he's actually talking about his book a little bit here, and some of the components that he discusses in that book. It actually sounds like a really interesting book, and I'm not here to advertise the book or anything, but it's kind of an interesting study or read, I guess. So, in this second portion of a talk at the Dallas Conference in Science and Faith, philosopher Steve Meyer discusses the ways in which groundbreaking astronomer Fred Hoyle, who lived from 1915 to 2001, dealt with the fact that the universe seems fine-tuned for life. Hoyle's widely cited comment on the subject was, quote, "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature." That was an unsettling idea for Hoyle, who was a well-known atheist, and he certainly sought ways around it. How did he fare? So, this is, like I said, he's the author of The Return of the God Hypothesis, and so a sample of the book kind of gives a sample of the book. But then there's also, he kind of, as it mentioned at the beginning, there was a seminar or a talk that he gave back in 2021 in Dallas, and so this is kind of, it's a four-part article, so to speak, in which he kind of discusses some of these aspects that he included in his book. And so part of this, I want to look at the first part and the last part, because the middle of it contains a whole bunch of science. So Stephen Meyer, this is his talking to this is a transcript of his talk, as well as, again, was part of his book. Now, some of the most important fine-tuning parameters were first discovered by Sir Fred Hoyle, a British-Australian astronomer and astrophysicist. Hoyle was in his early career a staunch atheist, and in fact he was quoted as saying that, quote, "Religion is but a desperate attempt to find an escape from the truly dreadful situation in which we find ourselves." Talk about depressing. He went on to say that people don't like him because he took away hope by saying things like that, which is exactly true. In any case, Hoyle was working on theories of how carbon formed, and he was struck by a big mystery. In case you don't know, carbon is kind of the basis for all life on Earth. Carbon molecules are comprised in anything organic. And says he was struck by a big mystery, which is, why is there so much carbon in the universe? He realized that carbon was super important because carbon forms long chain-like molecules that are necessary for any form of life to exist. Without carbon, there is no possibility of life. And so, like I said, the body of this article goes into describing a lot of scientific aspects, molecules and how carbon molecules come about. How did, again, as an atheist, he was trying to consider how in the Big Bang carbon could have been formed so rapidly, and so much of it could have been formed. But he goes on to describe the fact that in the end, nothing really made sense. There was really no explanation, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. Because what he began to realize is that everything had to be extremely finely tuned and everything balanced just right for everything that exists to exist. Not even talking about going back to the Big Bang, but just in general. Everything that exists, for it to exist, has to be very finely tuned. There was a whole suite of these so-called cosmic coincidences, where everything had to be just right to explain what was necessary to life. Just to produce carbon, Here are 5 of these cosmic coincidences. So this is just talking about carbon. This isn't taking into account any other aspect of our universe and what makes up the laws of our universe. Number 1, the gravitational force, what physicists call the force constant, that determines the exact strength of gravitation, had to be just right. If it were larger, stars would be too hot and they would burn up too quickly and too unevenly. If the gravitational force constant and the force of gravity were smaller, stars would remain so cool that nuclear fusion, in other words, the energy producing aspect at the core of stars, would never ignite. And hence there'd never be any heavy element production. And so there wouldn't be any heat. The electromagnetic force constant also had to be delicately balanced. If it was larger, the chemical bonding wouldn't occur, and elements more massive than boron would be too unstable for fission. If smaller, it would be insufficient to produce chemical bonding. And so it went. Then numbers 3 and 4, the other fundamental forces of physics, the so-called strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force, that's 3 and 4, had to be delicately balanced. If either of these forces were too large or too small by very small fractions, there would be no possibility of forming stable elements. The basic chemistry of life would be impossible, and we would not have a life-permitting universe. And then finally, number 5, on top of all that, it turns out that the fundamental units of matter, which are quarks, which make up the protons and neutrons, had to be very precise masses in order for the right nuclear reactions to occur that would produce the right elements, such as carbon and oxygen, that are necessary for a life-permitting universe. And in the case of the mass of the quarks, there are up quarks and down quarks. 9 separate sets of criteria must be met simultaneously to make the basic chemistry of life possible. And again, that we're not just talking about as if they're trying to argue that the God started the Big Bang or some aspect of that. We're talking about life in general. As of right now, if any of these things were different or off, life couldn't exist. As Hoyle began to reflect on all this, it occurred to him that we lived in a kind of Goldilocks universe where everything was just right. The forces were not too strong, not too weak. The masses were not too large, not too small. And he started to rethink his staunch materialist atheist worldview. And again, this talk goes on, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. This is just one, and we may look at some of the others as well. But these 2 final excerpts here kind of describe some of what he discusses in his book. Not Hoyle. Hoyle is the scientist that Meyer is talking about. But Meyer, in his book, this is one of the excerpts, and it's that. Well, this actually may be part of the next actual talk, but this may be part of the book. But if DNA is a language, who is the speaker? Steve Meyer talks about the significance of Francis Crick's sequence hypothesis that showed that DNA is a language of life. What sort of speaker can utter a language that produces living beings? I'd never heard it put that way, but I thought that was a really cool thought, is what kind of a speaker, how powerful must a God be to be able to utter a language that produces living beings? And obviously our God is all-powerful. Is it a fluctuation of a multiverse or an intelligence that underlies nature? In other words, is it some random chance within an infinite number of universes that we just happen to live in this one? Or is there an intelligence that actually created it all? And then this last part, life is so wonderfully fine-tuned that it's frightening. A mathematician who uses statistical methods to model the fine-tuning of molecular machines and systems in cells reflects that every single cell is like a city that cannot function without a complex network of services that must all work together to maintain life. And so, like I said, I was reading through this, and I just, some of this, my eyes kind of crossed a little bit with some of the science that they're talking about. But I thought this was a really interesting study, and I'm actually going to look further into the rest of the articles in this talk that he that he gave in Dallas here in 2021 and look a little bit deeper in it, because there seems to be a lot of real science explained here that you don't hear in science class, that you don't hear people talk about or atheists talk about or whatnot. And it sounds as though this is an individual, and I haven't looked up Fred Hoyle and I don't know all the details, but it sounds as if at one time he was a staunch atheist, but then in his efforts to show that all of this was created by chance, he kind of learned better. It sounds as though maybe he kind of taught himself out of being a staunch atheist, but I don't know. But anyway, all of that to say that it kind of brings to my mind one aspect of God's Word, or obviously there's plenty of aspects of God's Word that this applies to, but certainly Psalm 19, starting in verse 1, David says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." This term line carries with it the sense of a plucking of a string, as in on an instrument. It's their sound, their noise, in essence, it is a message, but that's why you have kind of the line and then their words here in verse 4. You've got their line has gone out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. And this music, so to speak, that they sing is the music of the creation of the world by an all-powerful God. And certainly Paul kind of hints at this or references this concept in Romans 1 as he describes individuals who had rejected God and had turned God rather into an idol and chose to follow after the things they wanted. He says, because God, or what may be known of God, is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Well, who's the they here? The they are us. They are us. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Seen in what? Seen in nature? Absolutely seen in nature. But to an extent, even in us, as that quote at the end of that article about the language of DNA, and the fact that what kind of being could utter speech of DNA and create living beings, being understood by the things that are made. Who are the things? We are. It's not just all creation, it's us specifically. Even we can observe his eternal power, his dominion, the nature of the Godhead being spiritual, so that they, not plants and animals, we, so that they are without excuse. We are what Paul's considering in verse 20. And we are what's being considered here, here in verse 19. Because verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against not nature, but against the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteous. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them. What may be known of God is manifest. Yes, it's manifest in nature, but it's manifest in us as well. Just our existence, the complexity of life. God has shown us the complexity. God has shown us his power. And so we, and certainly Paul's in context describing Gentiles, and even more broadly applied, those without God, they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, man has always had law from God, starting with Adam and Eve, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So, I just thought that was a really interesting article and a really interesting kind of going through some of that science, and the fact that a staunch atheist potentially could look into the depths of these scientific prospects and aspects, and realize that there is a whole lot more to the universe and creation than just random chance. And I think that's awesome. All right, that's the devotional for you today. Lord willing, we'll pick up on Thursday at 6:30. Hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.